Have you ever been in a language class where you could absolutely ace the grammar test, but you couldn't order a coffee to save your life? You are definitely not alone. Today, we're going to dive into communicative language teaching, an approach that basically flipped language education right on its head. The goal? To turn those silent, rule-memorizing students into confident, real-world speakers.
And this quote, wow, it just nails the problem, doesn't it? It paints a picture of a classroom where students know all the rules of a language, but they're just terrified to actually use it. They're paralyzed by this fear of making a mistake. And that is the exact challenge that communicative language teaching, or a CLT, was built to solve.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to unpack that silent classroom problem. Then we'll see how this communication-first approach completely revolutionized everything. We'll get into the core idea, moving beyond perfect grammar, and see what it actually looks like in practice. We'll also talk about the teacher's brand new role in all of this, and we'll wrap it all up with that big classic debate, fluency versus accuracy.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Before CLT came along, if you walked into a language classroom, it was probably a place of really quiet memorization, not a whole lot of conversation. The focus wasn't on speaking. It was on something, well, a lot more rigid.
Think back to these old-school methods. You had grammar translation, where you'd spend hours, and I mean hours, just translating texts. Or the audiolingual method, with those endless, mind-numbing repeat-after-me drills. The theory was, hey, if you just master all the structures and memorize all the words, eventually you'll be able to speak. The problem was, for so many people, eventually just never showed up. You ended up with a ton of knowledge about the language, but almost no ability to actually use it.
So yeah, people started getting really frustrated. Educators realized that, knowing all the rules of chess doesn't mean you know how to play a game. Language learning needed a total revolution.
And that revolution really kicked off in the 1970s. After decades of these super structured methods, frustration just hit a boiling point. And this wasn't some stuffy academic shift. It was a reaction to a changing world. Think about it. With globalization and migration picking up, there was this sudden, urgent need for people who could actually use another language for their job, for travel, for just life. So educators in Europe developed CLT, and they put real, messy, practical communication right at the heart of the whole process.
Now this comparison, it just lays it all out so clearly. It's like night and day. The old way was all about the teacher. They lecture, you absorb. The number one goal was accuracy, which meant avoiding mistakes at all costs. CLT just flips that entire script. It's learner-centered. It's about fluency, about getting your message across. The goal is to use language in situations that feel real. And, this is the big one, making mistakes is seen as a totally natural, even necessary part of learning.
So, if the goal isn't just about nailing every single grammar rule, then what is it? Well, this is where we get to the core theory behind CLT, a concept that honestly changed the game.
And that big idea is called communicative competence. A linguist named Del Himes came up with it, and he basically argued that knowing all the grammar in the world is useless if you don't know how to actually use it in a conversation. The point is, it's not just what you know, it's what you can do with what you know. It's about being understood, being appropriate for the situation, and getting your point across, whether you're just asking for directions or debating a serious topic.
Later, other researchers broke this down into 4 key parts. First, you've still got grammatical competence. Yeah, you do need to know the rules. But then you add sociolinguistic competence, which is knowing when to be formal versus when you can be casual. There's also discourse competence, which is about knowing how to string sentences together to tell a story or make a point. And finally, strategic competence, which is basically your backup plan. It's knowing what to do when you forget a word or you don't understand something, so you can keep the conversation from just stopping dead.
Okay, that all sounds great in theory, but how do you actually teach that way? Let's take a look at what this all means for what happens inside a real classroom.
Well, the biggest difference is the shift from just sitting there and listening to actually getting up and doing something. A CLT classroom is usually pretty busy, a little noisy, and just full of interaction.
So yeah, instead of seeing desks in perfect rows all facing a teacher, you're much more likely to see students working in pairs or small groups, actually talking to each other. The whole focus is on completing tasks that force them to communicate, to figure out what the other person means, and to work together, just like you have to do out in the real world.
Role-playing is such a classic CLT activity, and it really shows you how it works. The teacher sets up a real-world scenario, like, say, a customer complaining at a hotel front desk.
Students get their roles, they get a problem they have to solve, and then they're just let loose. They've got to think on their feet, use all those communication strategies, and actually talk to each other to achieve their goal. The real learning happens right there, in the act of doing.
And of course, it's not just role-playing, there are so many other activities. You've got things like information gap activities, where one person has a piece of information that the other person needs. You've got group discussions, fun games like Taboo that force you to be creative with your words, or even just simple interviews. But what do they all have in common? They create a genuine, authentic need to communicate.
So as you can probably imagine, when the classroom becomes this active and learner-driven, the teacher's job has to change. I mean, it has to change dramatically.
There's a great saying for this. The teacher moves from being the sage on the stage, the one person with all the knowledge, to the guide on the side. They're less of a lecturer and much more of a coach, a resource, and even a fellow communicator.
A CLT teacher is basically wearing 3 different hats at once. First, they are a facilitator, designing the activities that get students talking. Second, they're a monitor, moving around the room, listening in, and offering a little bit of help or guidance when it's needed. And third, they're a co-communicator. They might even jump into an activity right alongside the students, not as a boss, but just as another participant helping to model the language.
Okay, so let's bring this all home. At the absolute heart of communicative language teaching is this huge shift in what we think is important. And this is why it still sparks a lot of debate, especially when you start talking about grades. I mean, if you're not just marking up grammar tests, how do you even measure a student's progress?
And this right here is the most crucial point. In CLT, you don't learn all the rules first and then try to communicate later. You learn to communicate by communicating. That whole process of trying to express yourself, of figuring out what someone means, of making mistakes and getting help, that is the learning process. Communication isn't just the destination, it's the road you take to get there.
And that brings us right back to making mistakes. This quote just sums up the CLT attitude perfectly. A mistake isn't a failure. It's evidence that you're trying. It shows you're taking risks and pushing yourself. The focus completely shifts from punishing every little error to encouraging the confidence to just speak, even if it's not perfect.
And that leaves us with this final thought to chew on. Communicative language teaching puts a huge emphasis on getting your message across effectively, on fluency. But of course, accuracy, or getting it right, still matters. So the big question for both teachers and learners is this. In a world that needs clear communication now more than ever, where do we find that perfect balance between just being understood and being perfectly correct?